Mahatma Gandhi is a towering figure in modern history, known primarily for his role in leading India to independence through nonviolent means. Yet, while his public image is often tied to Hinduism, the true nature of his spiritual philosophy is far more complex and nuanced. Gandhi was not simply a devout Hindu, he was a seeker of truth, influenced by multiple religious traditions, including Jainism, Christianity, Islam, and, significantly, Buddhism. The teachings of the Buddha, particularly the concepts of ahiṃsā, nonviolence, and karuṇā, compassion, were instrumental in shaping Gandhi's approach to both personal conduct and political activism. The Buddha's emphasis on the cessation of suffering and the cultivation of compassion deeply resonated with Gandhi, who sought to apply these principles to the context of colonial India. While Gandhi drew heavily from his Hindu roots, his engagement with Buddhism provided a framework for understanding how nonviolence and compassion could be used as tools for social and political transformation. This essay explores the profound influence of Buddhist philosophy on Gandhi's life and work, examining how Buddhist principles of nonviolence, compassion, self-discipline, and ethical leadership became central to his strategy for India's independence and his broader vision for a just and compassionate society. The objective of this essay is to provide a comprehensive analysis of the Buddhist influences on Gandhi's life and thought. Through an exploration of key Buddhist teachings, historical encounters, and practical applications of these ideas, this essay aims to shed light on how Gandhi's synthesis of Hinduism and Buddhism shaped his approach to leadership, resistance, and the moral development of society. Gandhi's early life and exposure to religious thought. Born on October 2, 1869, in Porbandar, a small coastal town in Gujarat, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi grew up in a deeply religious household. His mother, Putlabai, was a devout Hindu who also practiced Jainism, a religion that shares many similarities with Buddhism, especially in its emphasis on nonviolence and asceticism. From an early age, Gandhi was exposed to religious diversity, witnessing the rituals and practices of Hinduism, Jainism, and Islam in his community. This early exposure to religious pluralism planted the seeds for Gandhi's later interest in interfaith dialogue and his deep respect for all religious traditions. While Hinduism provided the primary religious framework for Gandhi's upbringing, Jainism's influence on his early life cannot be understated. Jainism, much like Buddhism, places a strong emphasis on ahiṃsā, or nonviolence, and the renunciation of worldly attachments. These concepts resonated with young Gandhi and would later become central to his political philosophy. Additionally, Jainism's ascetic practices, including fasting and self-denial, foreshadowed Gandhi's later use of fasting as a means of self-purification and political protest. Gandhi's formal education took him to England in 1888, where he studied law at University College London. During his time in England, Gandhi encountered Western religious traditions, particularly Christianity, which introduced him to the teachings of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. These teachings, with their emphasis on love, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek, had a profound impact on Gandhi's understanding of nonviolence. However, it was during this period that Gandhi also began to engage with Buddhist philosophy through his reading and personal interactions. The concept of ahiṃsā, nonviolence, in Hinduism and Buddhism. The concept of ahiṃsā, or nonviolence, is a common thread that runs through both Hinduism and Buddhism, but the way it is interpreted and practiced differs between the two traditions. In Hinduism, ahiṃsā is generally understood as an ethical principle, urging individuals to avoid causing harm to other living beings. It is one of the key tenets of Dharma, righteousness, and is closely associated with personal purity and moral conduct. In Buddhism, however, ahiṃsā takes on a broader and more active dimension. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that nonviolence is not simply the absence of physical violence but the cultivation of mental discipline, compassion, and loving-kindness, metta. This holistic interpretation of nonviolence resonated deeply with Gandhi and influenced his understanding of how to apply ahiṃsā in the political arena. For the Buddha, nonviolence was part of a larger ethical framework that aimed to reduce suffering in all its forms, physical, emotional, and spiritual. in Gandhi's view, nonviolence was the greatest force available to humanity, and he believed that it had the power to bring about social and political change without perpetuating cycles of violence and hatred. He often stated that nonviolence was not just a strategy for political resistance but a way of life, one that required self-discipline, compassion, and moral courage. This perspective aligned closely with the Buddha's teachings on the Noble Eightfold Path. Particularly the emphasis on right intention and right action, Gandhi's engagement with Buddhist philosophy enriched his understanding of ahiṃsā by deepening his appreciation for the ethical and spiritual dimensions of nonviolence. While Hinduism provided the foundation for his commitment to ahiṃsā, Buddhism offered a more comprehensive framework for understanding how nonviolence could be applied not only to personal conduct but also to social and political struggles. The Buddha's influence on Gandhi's philosophy, though Gandhi's formal education and spiritual upbringing were primarily rooted in Hinduism and other Indian traditions, his later engagement with Buddhist philosophy played a crucial role in shaping his views on nonviolence, suffering, and compassion. Buddhism's core teachings, especially the Buddha's emphasis on ethical living and the cessation of suffering, had a profound impact on Gandhi's personal and political life. Gandhi often spoke of the Buddha with deep reverence, referring to him as a spiritual guide whose life and teachings provided an invaluable moral compass. For Gandhi, the Buddha's renunciation of material wealth and power, in pursuit of enlightenment and liberation from suffering, was a model of ethical leadership and spiritual discipline. As Gandhi delved deeper into Buddhist philosophy, he found significant overlaps between the teachings of the Buddha and his own evolving views on morality, politics, and nonviolence. Buddhist texts and teachings that influenced Gandhi. One of the primary Buddhist teachings that influenced Gandhi was the Four Noble Truths, which outline the nature of suffering and the path to its cessation. The Buddha taught that suffering, dukkha, is an inherent part of human existence, caused by attachment, ignorance, and desire. However, the Buddha also offered a way to overcome this suffering through the Noble Eightfold Path, a guide to ethical living that promotes wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Gandhi embraced these ideas, particularly the notion that attachment to worldly possessions, power, and ego is the root cause of suffering. He applied this understanding not only to his personal life but also to his political philosophy. For example, Gandhi's call for Swaraj, self-rule, was not merely about political independence from British rule, it was also about liberating the Indian people from their attachment to materialism, greed, and exploitation. In this sense, Gandhi's vision of independence was deeply intertwined with the Buddha's teachings on overcoming suffering through ethical living and spiritual awakening. Another key Buddhist teaching that influenced Gandhi was the concept of right action, part of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right action, according to the Buddha, involves abstaining from violence, theft, and harmful behavior, while promoting compassion, generosity, and respect for all living beings. Gandhi adopted this principle wholeheartedly, applying it not only to his personal conduct but also to his leadership in the Indian independence movement. He often emphasized that true freedom could not be achieved through violent means, as violence would only perpetuate cycles of suffering and injustice. Engagement with Buddhist scholars and practitioners. Throughout his life, Gandhi engaged with Buddhist scholars, monks, and practitioners, seeking to deepen his understanding of the Buddha's teachings. One of the most notable encounters was with the renowned Anagarika Dharmapala, a Sri Lankan Buddhist revivalist and founder of the Mahabodhi Society. Dharmapala was instrumental in restoring Buddhist practices in India and raising awareness of the Buddha's teachings on a global scale. Gandhi's correspondence and meetings with Dharmapala helped him gain a deeper appreciation for the ethical and philosophical dimensions of Buddhism. In his discussions with Buddhist scholars, Gandhi explored the relationship between personal morality and social justice, a central theme in Buddhist teachings. The Buddha's emphasis on self-discipline and mindfulness resonated with Gandhi's own beliefs in the importance of self-restraint and ethical conduct in the pursuit of political change. Through these dialogues, Gandhi further developed his conviction that individual transformation was a prerequisite for societal transformation, a core principle in both Buddhist and Gandhian thought. Additionally, Gandhi's close association with Vinoba Bhave, a disciple of his who later became a key figure in the Indian Sarvodaya movement, also highlights the influence of Buddhist principles on his philosophy. Bhave, who was deeply influenced by both Gandhi and Buddhist teachings, advocated for Buddhan land donation as a peaceful and compassionate solution to landlessness and poverty in India. This initiative reflected the Buddhist emphasis on dana, generosity, and the ethical responsibility to care for others. The Buddhist teachings on compassion and suffering in Gandhi's framework for resistance. One of the most significant ways in which Buddhism influenced Gandhi was through the Buddha's teachings on compassion and the alleviation of suffering. The Buddha taught that true compassion, karuṇā, involves recognizing the interconnectedness of all beings and seeking to alleviate their suffering through acts of kindness, empathy, and nonviolence. This principle became central to Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, a form of nonviolent resistance grounded in truth and love. For Gandhi, compassion was not just an abstract ideal, it was a practical guide for political action. He believed that true resistance to oppression must be rooted in a deep sense of compassion for both the oppressed and the oppressor. In line with Buddhist teachings, Gandhi saw the British colonialists not as enemies to be defeated but as fellow human beings who were themselves trapped in a system of ignorance and greed. He often stated that the goal of satyagraha was not to humiliate or destroy the oppressors but to appeal to their sense of justice and humanity, ultimately transforming their hearts and minds. This compassionate approach to resistance is exemplified in Gandhi's campaigns for India's independence, where he consistently advocated for non-violent methods such as boycotts, civil disobedience, and non-cooperation. Gandhi's insistence on non-violence, even in the face of brutal repression, was a direct reflection of the Buddha's teachings on compassion and the rejection of violence as a means to achieve justice. Like the Buddha, Gandhi believed that true liberation could only be achieved through peaceful means that upheld the dignity and humanity of all people. In this way, Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha can be seen as a practical application of the Buddha's teachings on karuṇā and ahiṃsā, adapted to the context of modern political struggles. Gandhi's ability to integrate these Buddhist principles into his leadership and activism helped to create a powerful and transformative movement that not only sought political independence but also aimed to foster a more just and compassionate society. Satyagraha, a synthesis of Hindu and Buddhist values, one of Gandhi's most enduring contributions to the world was his development of satyagraha, a method of non-violent resistance that has since been adopted by social and political movements across the globe. At its core, satyagraha is a synthesis of values from Hinduism, Buddhism, and other spiritual traditions, blending the Hindu concept of truth, satya, with the Buddhist principles of non-violence, ahiṃsā, and compassion, karuṇā. Gandhi defined satyagraha as truth force or soul force, emphasizing that the pursuit of justice must be rooted in truth, love, and non-violence. For Gandhi, satyagraha was not merely a political tactic but a spiritual discipline that required self-purification, ethical conduct, and an unwavering commitment to truth. In many ways, satyagraha reflected the Buddhist path to enlightenment, where the individual must cultivate moral virtues, self-awareness, and compassion in order to achieve liberation from suffering. The origins of satyagraha. Gandhi first developed the concept of satyagraha during his time in South Africa, where he led campaigns against racial discrimination and the oppressive policies of the colonial government. It was in South Africa that Gandhi began to experiment with non-violent resistance as a means of confronting injustice. Drawing on his Hindu upbringing, as well as his encounters with Buddhist teachings, Gandhi gradually developed satyagraha as a philosophy of resistance that rejected violence in all its forms. One of the key influences on the development of satyagraha was Leo Tolstoy, the Russian writer and philosopher who advocated for Christian pacifism and non-violent resistance to oppression. Gandhi corresponded with Tolstoy and was inspired by his ideas on love, truth, and the moral imperative to resist evil without resorting to violence. Although Tolstoy's ideas were rooted in Christianity, they resonated with both Hindu and Buddhist teachings, particularly the Buddha's emphasis on non-violence and compassion. Satyagraha also drew inspiration from the Jain principle of ahiṃsā, which Gandhi had encountered during his early life in Gujarat. Jainism, like Buddhism, places a strong emphasis on nonviolence as the highest form of ethical conduct. However, it was the Buddhist interpretation of ahiṃsā, which focuses not only on refraining from violence but also on cultivating positive virtues such as compassion and mindfulness, that had a lasting impact on Gandhi's understanding of nonviolence. Buddhist principles in Satyagraha. Several key Buddhist principles can be seen in Gandhi's philosophy of Satyagraha, particularly the emphasis on ethical conduct, compassion, and mindfulness. In Buddhism, ethical conduct is essential for achieving enlightenment, and it involves following the 5 precepts, which include abstaining from killing, stealing, lying, and harmful behavior. Gandhi applied these ethical principles to the political realm, insisting that those who participated in Satyagraha must adhere to strict moral discipline and avoid any form of harm, whether physical or verbal. Compassion, or karuṇā, was another central element of Satyagraha, as Gandhi believed that true resistance to injustice must be rooted in love and empathy for all people, including the oppressors. This compassionate approach to resistance reflected the Buddhist ideal of universal compassion, where the goal is not to defeat or destroy the adversary but to transform their heart and mind. Gandhi often spoke of Satyagraha as a form of moral jiu-jitsu, where the practitioner of nonviolence seeks to disarm the oppressor through love, rather than force. Mindfulness, or sati, is a key component of the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism, and it involves cultivating awareness of one's thoughts, emotions, and actions. Gandhi emphasized the importance of self-discipline and mindfulness in the practice of Satyagraha, urging his followers to remain calm, patient, and focused, even in the face of violence or provocation. For Gandhi, mindfulness was essential for maintaining the moral high ground and ensuring that the resistance remained nonviolent and grounded in truth. Case studies: nonviolent campaigns during the Indian independence movement. Gandhi's philosophy of Satyagraha was put into practice in several key campaigns during the Indian independence movement, each of which demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance to confront injustice. One of the most famous examples is the Salt March of 1930, a 240-mile march led by Gandhi to protest the British monopoly on salt production and taxation. The Salt March was a form of civil disobedience, where Gandhi and thousands of his followers defied British law by making their own salt from seawater. The Salt March exemplified many of the Buddhist principles that Gandhi had incorporated into Satyagraha, particularly the emphasis on nonviolence, self-discipline, and compassion. Despite being met with violent repression by British authorities, the marchers remained peaceful and steadfast in their commitment to nonviolence. Gandhi's leadership during the Salt March reflected the Buddhist ideal of ethical leadership, where the leader sets an example of moral conduct and inspires others to follow through their own actions. Another important example of Satyagraha in action was the Quit India movement of 1942. Where Gandhi called for the immediate withdrawal of British forces from India. The movement was marked by widespread acts of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance, as millions of Indians refused to cooperate with British authorities. Although the British responded with brutal repression, Gandhi insisted that the movement remain nonviolent, arguing that violence would only undermine the moral authority of the resistance. Compassion, karuṇā, as a driving force in Gandhi's life. Compassion, or karuṇā, is one of the most fundamental principles in Buddhism, emphasizing the alleviation of suffering for all sentient beings. It is a quality that is not merely passive but deeply active, involving an empathetic response that seeks to relieve the suffering of others. Gandhi's entire life, from his personal relationships to his political campaigns, was driven by this deep sense of compassion. His actions were consistently aligned with the Buddhist understanding of karuṇā, and he sought to apply this principle not just in individual cases but in the broader socio-political landscape of India.
In Buddhist teachings, karuṇā is often paired with wisdom, prajna, emphasizing that compassion should be exercised in ways that are thoughtful, ethical, and beneficial for all. For Gandhi, this wisdom manifested in his belief that compassion should inform not only personal relationships but also the larger struggle for justice and equality. He saw no contradiction between practicing compassion and engaging in political resistance. In fact, he believed that compassion was the only way to bring about true and lasting social change. Buddhist view of compassion and its role in moral life. the Buddhist understanding of compassion goes beyond simple acts of kindness. In the Buddha's teachings, compassion is closely tied to an understanding of the interconnectedness of all beings. This interconnectedness implies that the suffering of one individual is ultimately linked to the suffering of all, and therefore, relieving another's suffering is also a step toward relieving one's own. In this context, compassion becomes a moral imperative. One is not only ethically obligated to be compassionate but is also motivated by the recognition that helping others helps oneself. Gandhi's Sarvodaya movement, which called for the welfare of all, mirrors this Buddhist ideal. He believed that a free and just India could only be built when the needs of the most marginalized, particularly the poor, the untouchables, Dalits, and women, were prioritized. This vision of society, where the suffering of the least privileged is addressed first, is deeply aligned with the Buddha's teachings, where compassion for all sentient beings is central to ethical conduct. Gandhi's use of karuṇā in his dealings with political opponents. One of the most striking ways Gandhi applied the principle of karuṇā was in his treatment of his political adversaries, including the British colonial rulers. Gandhi consistently argued that even though the British were oppressing the Indian people, they themselves were victims of their own ignorance, greed, and desire for power. For Gandhi, this meant that the British, too, were deserving of compassion, as their actions were rooted in delusion, a key cause of suffering in Buddhist philosophy. Throughout his campaigns, Gandhi stressed that the goal was not to defeat or humiliate the British, but to free them from the moral burden of being oppressors. In his letter to Lord Irwin, the British Viceroy of India, in 1930, Gandhi expressed his desire for mutual understanding and reconciliation. Despite opposing British rule, he wrote with great respect, emphasizing that his resistance was driven by a moral obligation to truth and justice, rather than anger or hatred. Gandhi's insistence on maintaining this compassionate attitude towards his adversaries was a practical demonstration of the Buddhist ideal of loving kindness, or metta, extended even towards those who would be considered enemies. Furthermore, Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence, even in the face of extreme provocation, was an expression of his compassion for both the oppressed and the oppressors. He believed that violence, even when used to resist oppression, would only lead to further suffering. This belief reflects the Buddhist teaching that hatred can never be overcome by hatred, but only by love and understanding. In this sense, Gandhi's compassion was not passive but actively sought to transform the hearts and minds of his opponents through nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's campaigns for the oppressed and marginalized, Dalits, women, and the rural poor. One of Gandhi's most profound applications of karuṇā was his lifelong struggle for the upliftment of the untouchables, Dalits, who were marginalized and discriminated against under India's rigid caste system. Gandhi referred to them as Harijans, meaning children of God, a term that reflected his deep compassion for their suffering. He sought not only to improve their social and economic conditions but also to challenge the very foundations of the caste system, which he viewed as an affront to human dignity and justice. Gandhi's efforts on behalf of the Dalits were motivated by his belief in the inherent equality of all human beings, a principle that is deeply rooted in both Hindu and Buddhist teachings. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, non-self, teaches that there is no intrinsic difference between beings, and therefore, all are equally deserving of compassion and respect. Gandhi's campaigns for the Dalits reflected this understanding, as he sought to break down the social barriers that perpetuated inequality and suffering. Similarly, Gandhi's advocacy for women's rights was driven by his belief in the moral and spiritual equality of all people. He often spoke out against the patriarchal structures that oppressed women, arguing that a truly free India could not exist without the full participation and empowerment of women. Gandhi's campaigns for women's rights were not merely political but were rooted in his deep compassion for their suffering and his desire to create a society that recognized the dignity and worth of all individuals. Gandhi's compassion also extended to the rural poor, who made up the vast majority of India's population. He believed that the true measure of a society's progress was not its industrial or military power but the well-being of its poorest citizens. In his campaigns for Swaraj, self-rule, Gandhi consistently emphasized the importance of addressing the needs of the rural poor, advocating for land reform, village self-sufficiency, and the promotion of handicrafts such as khadi, hand-woven cloth, to provide employment and dignity to the rural population. In his writings and speeches, Gandhi often invoked the image of the Buddha as a model for compassionate leadership, pointing to the Buddha's renunciation of wealth and power in favor of a life dedicated to the service of others. Just as the Buddha chose to live among the poor and oppressed, Gandhi believed that true leaders must prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable members of society. This compassionate vision of leadership was central to Gandhi's philosophy and was reflected in all aspects of his work. Connections between Gandhi's compassion and his broader vision for India's future. Gandhi's compassionate approach to social and political reform was not limited to addressing immediate injustices, it was also part of his broader vision for a just and compassionate society. He believed that India's future should be built on the principles of nonviolence, compassion, and mutual respect, rather than on the violent and exploitative systems that had characterized colonial rule. This vision of a compassionate society was deeply influenced by the Buddhist ideal of an ethical and harmonious community, where individuals live in accordance with moral principles and seek the well-being of all. In his vision for a free and independent India, Gandhi emphasized the importance of social and economic justice, arguing that political independence would be meaningless without addressing the deep inequalities that plagued Indian society. He advocated for a form of decentralized governance, where villages would be self-sufficient and organized around principles of cooperation, mutual aid, and compassion. This vision reflected the Buddhist ideal of a compassionate society, where individuals work together for the common good and where the well-being of all members is prioritized. Moreover, Gandhi's call for sarvodaya, or the welfare of all, was deeply aligned with the Buddhist teaching that the happiness and liberation of all beings are interconnected. In Gandhi's view, the true measure of a nation's greatness was not its wealth or military power but the extent to which it cared for its most vulnerable citizens. His compassionate vision for India's future was a direct challenge to the hierarchical and exploitative systems that had been imposed by colonial rule, and it offered a radical alternative based on ethical principles and the promotion of social justice. Gandhi's ethical leadership. The impact of Buddhist morality. Gandhi's ethical leadership was grounded in his deep engagement with both Hindu and Buddhist moral teachings. While his Hindu background provided the foundation for his spiritual and ethical development, it was through his engagement with Buddhist morality that Gandhi was able to articulate a more comprehensive and universal vision of ethical leadership. The Buddha's teachings on ethical conduct, compassion, and non-violence provided Gandhi with a moral framework that he applied not only in his personal life but also in his leadership of the Indian independence movement. Buddhism's role in shaping Gandhi's personal ethics. At the heart of Buddhist morality are the 5 precepts, which serve as ethical guidelines for living a moral life. These precepts include refraining from killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and intoxicants. While these ethical principles are not unique to Buddhism, their application in Buddhist practice emphasizes the importance of mindfulness and intentionality in all actions. For Gandhi, this mindfulness was essential in both personal and political life, as he believed that ethical leadership required constant self-awareness and moral discipline. Gandhi's commitment to non-violence, truth, and self-restraint can be seen as a direct reflection of the Buddhist emphasis on ethical conduct. He often spoke of the need for self-purification as a prerequisite for effective leadership, arguing that only those who had mastered their own desires and emotions could lead others with integrity. This focus on personal ethics and self-discipline was central to Gandhi's leadership philosophy and was deeply influenced by the Buddha's teachings on right intention and right action. Furthermore, Gandhi's practice of vegetarianism and his advocacy for the humane treatment of animals were informed by his commitment to the
Gandhi's fasting and self-discipline. As Buddhist practices, fasting and self-discipline were central components of Gandhi's personal and political life, and they were deeply influenced by both Hindu and Buddhist ascetic traditions. Gandhi's use of fasting as a form of non-violent protest reflected his belief in the power of self-sacrifice and moral persuasion to effect social change. In this sense, fasting was not merely a personal spiritual practice but a political tool that Gandhi used to draw attention to injustice and inspire others to take action. The role of asceticism in both Buddhism and Hinduism. Both Buddhism and Hinduism place a strong emphasis on asceticism, or the practice of self-denial, as a means of achieving spiritual purity and moral discipline. In Hinduism, ascetic practices such as fasting and celibacy are seen as ways of purifying the body and mind, allowing the individual to focus on spiritual growth. Similarly, in Buddhism, asceticism is an important aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path, particularly in the cultivation of right effort and right mindfulness. The Buddha himself engaged in extreme asceticism before realizing that the middle way, a path between self-indulgence and self-mortification, was the key to enlightenment. While the Buddha ultimately rejected extreme forms of asceticism, he continued to emphasize the importance of self-discipline and mindfulness as essential components of spiritual practice. This balance between renunciation and mindfulness was something that Gandhi sought to embody in his own life, as he believed that self-discipline was necessary for both personal and political liberation. Gandhi's use of fasting as a spiritual and political tool, Gandhi's use of fasting as a form of satyagraha, or non-violent resistance, was deeply influenced by both Hindu and Buddhist ascetic traditions. For Gandhi, fasting was a way of purifying the body and mind, allowing him to focus on higher moral and spiritual goals. However, fasting was not only a personal practice, it was also a powerful political statement. By voluntarily subjecting himself to physical suffering, Gandhi sought to draw attention to the suffering of others and to inspire his followers to embrace nonviolence and compassion. One of the most famous examples of Gandhi's use of fasting as a political tool was his fast unto death in 1932, in protest against the British government's decision to create separate electorates for the Dalits, then known as untouchables. Gandhi believed that this decision would further divide Indian society along caste lines and undermine the unity of the Indian independence movement. His fast was a deeply moral act, intended to bring about reconciliation and healing between the Dalits and the higher castes. In the end, his fast was successful, as it led to the Pune Pact, which abolished the separate electorates and promoted a more inclusive vision of Indian society. Gandhi's use of fasting as a form of moral persuasion reflected the Buddhist concept of upaya, or skillful means, where the individual seeks to find the most effective and compassionate way to bring about positive change. In this sense, fasting was not only an act of self-sacrifice but also a strategic tool that Gandhi used to influence both the oppressors and the oppressed. By demonstrating his willingness to suffer for the cause of justice, Gandhi sought to appeal to the conscience of his opponents and to inspire his followers to remain steadfast in their commitment to non-violence. Comparisons between Buddhist meditation practices and Gandhi's fasting. Gandhi's fasting can also be seen as a form of meditative practice, similar to the Buddhist practice of mindfulness and concentration. In both fasting and meditation, the individual seeks to cultivate self-awareness and self-control, focusing the mind on a higher goal. For Gandhi, fasting was a way of purifying the mind and body, allowing him to remain focused on his commitment to truth and non-violence. In Buddhism, meditation is an essential practice for developing right mindfulness and right concentration, both of which are necessary for achieving spiritual liberation. Similarly, Gandhi saw fasting as a way of cultivating self-discipline and mindfulness, allowing him to remain centered in his commitment to ethical conduct and non-violence. In this sense, fasting was not only a political act but also a spiritual practice. One that reflected Gandhi's deep engagement with Buddhist principles. Gandhi's vision of Swaraj, self-rule, and Buddhist social ethics. Gandhi's vision of Swaraj, or self-rule, was not limited to political independence from British colonial rule. It was also a vision of moral and spiritual self-governance, where individuals and communities would take responsibility for their own well-being and live in accordance with ethical principles. In this sense, Swaraj was deeply influenced by Buddhist social ethics, particularly the emphasis on self-reliance, compassion, and community welfare, defining Swaraj in the context of Gandhi's political thought. For Gandhi, Swaraj was more than just political autonomy. It was a comprehensive vision of self-governance that encompassed all aspects of life, personal, social, and political. In his writings, Gandhi often emphasized that true Swaraj could only be achieved when individuals and communities took responsibility for their own lives and lived in accordance with ethical principles. This vision of self-rule was deeply influenced by both Hindu and Buddhist teachings, which stressed the importance of self-discipline, compassion, and ethical conduct in all aspects of life. Gandhi's vision of Swaraj was also closely tied to his belief in decentralized governance, where power would be distributed among local communities rather than concentrated in a central authority. He believed that villages should be self-sufficient and organized around principles of cooperation and mutual aid, reflecting the Buddhist ideal of a compassionate and harmonious community. In this sense, Swaraj was not just about political independence, it was about creating a society that was grounded in ethical principles and where individuals took responsibility for the well-being of the entire community. Parallels between Swaraj and Buddhist teachings on self-reliance and community welfare. One of the key parallels between Gandhi's vision of Swaraj and Buddhist social ethics is the emphasis on self-reliance and community welfare. In Buddhism, the concept of Sangha refers to the community of practitioners who support one another in their spiritual development. The Buddha taught that individuals should take responsibility for their own spiritual growth while also supporting the well-being of the community. This emphasis on self-reliance and mutual aid is also central to Gandhi's vision of Swaraj, where individuals and communities are empowered to govern themselves and work together for the common good. Gandhi often spoke of the need for economic self-reliance in India, particularly in the rural villages, where he believed that true Swaraj could be realized. He advocated for the promotion of khadi, hand-woven cloth, as a symbol of self-reliance and a way to provide employment and dignity to the rural poor. This focus on economic self-reliance was deeply influenced by the Buddhist ideal of right livelihood, where individuals are encouraged to engage in ethical and sustainable forms of work that contribute to the well-being of the community. At the same time, Gandhi's emphasis on community welfare reflected the Buddhist teaching that the happiness and liberation of all beings are interconnected. In his vision of Swaraj, Gandhi sought to create a society where individuals and communities work together for the common good, promoting social and economic justice and ensuring that the needs of the most vulnerable were prioritized. This vision of a compassionate society was deeply aligned with the Buddhist ideal of a just and harmonious community, where individuals live in accordance with ethical principles and seek the welfare of all. Gandhi's vision for an ethical and compassionate society modeled on Buddhist values. Gandhi's vision for an ethical and compassionate society was deeply influenced by Buddhist values, particularly the emphasis on nonviolence, compassion, and ethical conduct. In his writings, Gandhi often spoke of the need to create a society that was grounded in truth and nonviolence, where individuals took responsibility for their own actions and worked together for the common good. This vision of society was closely aligned with the Buddhist ideal of a just and compassionate community, where individuals live in accordance with moral principles and seek to alleviate the suffering of all beings. For Gandhi, the true measure of a society's greatness was not its wealth or military power but the extent to which it cared for its most vulnerable citizens. In his vision of Swaraj, Gandhi sought to create a society where social and economic justice were prioritized, and where individuals and communities worked together in a spirit of compassion and mutual aid. Moreover, Gandhi's emphasis on ethical leadership and self-governance reflected the Buddhist teaching that individuals must take responsibility for their own spiritual and moral growth. Just as the Buddha taught that individuals must cultivate right intention and right action, Gandhi believed that true freedom could only be achieved when individuals took responsibility for their own lives and lived in accordance with ethical principles. In this sense, Gandhi's vision of Swaraj was not just a political goal but a spiritual and moral ideal, grounded in both Hindu and Buddhist values. Gandhi's dialogues with Buddhist leaders and scholars. Throughout his life, Mahatma Gandhi engaged in conversations with religious leaders, scholars, and practitioners of many faiths, including Buddhism. These dialogues not only enriched his understanding of Buddhist teachings but also influenced the development of his philosophy of nonviolent resistance, social justice, and ethical leadership. Gandhi's encounters with prominent Buddhist figures helped him to synthesize the ethical and philosophical foundations of Buddhism with his own spiritual and political beliefs. These conversations deepened his commitment to nonviolence, compassion, and moral leadership, values that are central to both Buddhism and Gandhi's political activism. Key encounters with Buddhist figures during Gandhi's life. One of the most notable encounters Gandhi had with a Buddhist leader was with Anagarika Dharmapala, a Sri Lankan Buddhist revivalist and the founder of the Mahabodhi Society. Dharmapala was instrumental in reviving interest in Buddhism in India and raising awareness about the significance of the Buddha's teachings in the context of modern social and political issues. Gandhi's discussions with Dharmapala helped to reinforce his belief in the power of Buddhist principles, particularly nonviolence and compassion, as tools for achieving social justice and spiritual liberation, Dharmapala admired Gandhi's efforts to resist British colonial rule through non-violent means. And their conversations centered on the ethical and spiritual dimensions of political activism. Dharmapala saw in Gandhi's Satyagraha movement a reflection of the Buddha's teachings on ethical conduct, non-violence, and the moral imperative to alleviate suffering. Gandhi, in turn, acknowledged Dharmapala's efforts to promote Buddhist values in India and around the world, and he viewed their collaboration as part of a broader spiritual mission to create a more just and compassionate society. Another important figure in Gandhi's engagement with Buddhism was Vinoba Bhave, one of Gandhi's closest disciples and the leader of the Sarvodaya movement. Bhave, who was deeply influenced by both Gandhi and Buddhist teachings, played a key role in promoting non-violence and social justice in post-independence India. Bhave's work in the Buddhism land gift movement, where he encouraged wealthy landowners to donate land to the poor, was inspired by the Buddhist emphasis on dana, generosity, and the ethical responsibility to care for others. Through his interactions with Bhave and other Buddhist-inspired leaders, Gandhi deepened his understanding of the practical applications of Buddhist ethics in the context of modern social and political struggles. These dialogues reinforced Gandhi's belief that true social change must be rooted in compassion, non-violence, and moral responsibility, values that are central to both Buddhist philosophy and Gandhi's own spiritual practice. Buddhist participation in the Indian independence movement. Buddhism played a significant role in the Indian independence movement, particularly through the participation of Buddhist leaders and communities who supported Gandhi's vision of a free and just India. Many Buddhists in India, Sri Lanka, and other parts of Asia were inspired by Gandhi's philosophy of Satyagraha, which resonated deeply with Buddhist teachings on non-violence, compassion, and ethical conduct. Buddhist monks, scholars, and lay people joined Gandhi in his campaigns for civil disobedience, boycotts, and non-violent resistance, viewing their participation as part of a broader moral and spiritual struggle for justice and liberation. One of the key contributions of Buddhism to the Indian independence movement was the emphasis on interfaith cooperation and mutual respect. Gandhi often spoke of the need for unity among India's diverse religious communities, and he believed that Buddhism, with its emphasis on tolerance, compassion, and non-violence, had an important role to play in fostering this unity. Buddhist leaders supported Gandhi's efforts to promote communal harmony between Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, and other religious groups, recognizing that true independence could only be achieved through the peaceful coexistence of all religious communities. The impact of dialogues with Buddhist scholars on Gandhi's evolving philosophy. Gandhi's dialogues with Buddhist scholars and practitioners helped him to refine and expand his understanding of Satyagraha as a form of moral and spiritual resistance. These conversations emphasized the importance of integrating ethical conduct, self-discipline, and compassion into political activism, reinforcing Gandhi's belief that true social change must be rooted in personal transformation and spiritual growth. Through his engagement with Buddhist teachings, Gandhi came to see non-violence not merely as a political strategy but as a way of life, one that required constant self-reflection, mindfulness, and ethical responsibility. This understanding of non-violence as both a personal and collective practice was deeply influenced by the Buddhist emphasis on right intention and right action, which Gandhi integrated into his leadership of the Indian independence movement. Moreover, Gandhi's dialogues with Buddhist scholars helped to shape his views on the interconnectedness of all beings, a central theme in Buddhist philosophy. Gandhi often spoke of the need to recognize the unity of all life and to act with compassion and respect toward all living beings. This recognition of interconnectedness informed Gandhi's campaigns for social and economic justice, as he sought to create a society where the welfare of all people, particularly the most vulnerable, was prioritized. How Gandhi fostered interfaith dialogues between Hindus, Buddhists, and other religious groups. One of Gandhi's most important contributions to the Indian independence movement was his commitment to fostering interfaith dialogue and cooperation between India's diverse religious communities. Gandhi believed that the struggle for independence was not just a political battle but also a moral and spiritual quest that required the participation of people from all religious backgrounds. He often spoke of the need for unity among Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, and others, arguing that true freedom could only be achieved through mutual respect and cooperation. In his dialogues with Buddhist leaders, Gandhi emphasized the importance of tolerance, compassion, and nonviolence as common values that could unite people of different faiths. He viewed Buddhism, with its emphasis on universal compassion and ethical conduct, as a key contributor to this interfaith vision. Gandhi often cited the Buddha as a model of moral leadership. Pointing to his teachings on nonviolence and compassion as a source of inspiration for people of all religions, Gandhi's efforts to promote interfaith dialogue were particularly important in the context of India's religious diversity and the tensions that often arose between different communities. By engaging with Buddhist leaders and scholars, Gandhi sought to create a shared moral framework that could unite people of different faiths in the pursuit of justice, peace, and compassion. This commitment to interfaith dialogue was a reflection of Gandhi's universalist philosophy, which emphasized the common ethical and spiritual values that underlie all religious traditions. Global legacy: Gandhi's influence on Buddhist movements and nonviolent leaders. Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, ahiṃsā, and compassion, karuṇā, deeply influenced by Buddhist teachings, has had a profound and lasting impact on global movements for justice, peace, and nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's ability to integrate the ethical principles of truth, satya, and nonviolence into a practical form of political activism inspired not only the Indian independence movement but also countless social and political struggles around the world. Many leaders of Buddhist and nonviolent movements have cited Gandhi as a key influence in their own work, and his legacy continues to shape the global discourse on peace and social justice. How Gandhi's philosophy influenced Buddhist movements worldwide. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha resonated deeply with many Buddhist leaders and movements, particularly those that were engaged in struggles for social justice, human rights, and political independence. The principles of nonviolence, compassion, and ethical conduct that Gandhi espoused were seen as closely aligned with the Buddhist teachings on moral action and the alleviation of suffering. As a result, Buddhist movements around the world have adopted Gandhi's methods of nonviolent resistance as a means of confronting injustice and promoting social change. One of the most prominent examples of Gandhi's influence on Buddhist movements is the struggle for Tibetan independence, led by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, who has often spoken of Gandhi's profound impact on his own approach to nonviolent resistance, has consistently advocated for a peaceful resolution to the Tibetan conflict with China. Like Gandhi, the Dalai Lama has emphasized the importance of compassion, nonviolence, and dialogue in resolving political disputes, and he has sought to apply these principles to the Tibetan cause. Gandhi's influence can also be seen in the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk and peace activist who has been a vocal advocate for nonviolent resistance to war and oppression. Thich Nhat Hanh has often cited Gandhi as a source of inspiration for his own philosophy of engaged Buddhism, which seeks to apply Buddhist principles to contemporary social and political issues. Like Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh believes that compassion and nonviolence are essential tools for achieving peace and justice, and he has dedicated his life to promoting these values in the context of the global peace movement. The Dalai Lama and other Buddhist leaders' reflections on Gandhi. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has often spoken of his deep admiration for Gandhi and the profound influence that Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence has had on his own spiritual and political leadership. In many of his speeches and writings, the Dalai Lama has emphasized the close alignment between Gandhian nonviolence and Buddhist teachings on compassion and ethical conduct. He has pointed to Gandhi as a model of moral leadership and has frequently called for the global community to embrace Gandhi's principles of nonviolence and truth as a means of resolving conflicts and promoting peace. In a 2009 speech commemorating the 140th anniversary of Gandhi's birth, the Dalai Lama described Gandhi as a great leader whose commitment to nonviolence and compassion continues to inspire people around the world. The Dalai Lama praised Gandhi's ability to integrate spiritual principles into political activism. And he called on world leaders to follow Gandhi's example by prioritizing peace, dialogue, and mutual respect in their efforts to resolve conflicts. Other Buddhist leaders, such as Aung San Suu Kyi, the Burmese political leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, have also cited Gandhi as a major influence in their own struggles for justice and democracy. Aung San Suu Kyi, who led the nonviolent resistance to military rule in Myanmar, has often spoken of her admiration for Gandhi's ability to inspire collective action through nonviolent means. She has described Gandhi's philosophy as a powerful tool for confronting oppression and promoting human dignity, and she has sought to apply these principles in her own leadership. Gandhi's impact on the global nonviolent movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Thich Nhat Hanh, Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence has had a profound impact not only on Buddhist movements but also on the broader global nonviolent movement, inspiring leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Thich Nhat Hanh. These leaders, each in their own way, have drawn upon Gandhi's teachings to confront injustice, oppression, and violence in their respective contexts. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, often spoke of Gandhi as a source of inspiration for his own philosophy of nonviolent resistance. King was first introduced to Gandhi's teachings while studying at Boston University, and he later traveled to India to learn more about Gandhi's work. King described Gandhi as the guiding light of the civil rights movement, and he adopted many of Gandhi's methods, including civil disobedience, boycotts, and peaceful marches, in his efforts to challenge racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. Similarly, Nelson Mandela, the anti-apartheid leader in South Africa, was deeply influenced by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. Although Mandela initially advocated for armed resistance against the apartheid regime, he later embraced nonviolence as a more effective means of achieving justice and reconciliation. Like Gandhi, Mandela believed that true freedom could only be achieved through forgiveness, compassion, and nonviolent resistance, and he sought to apply these principles in his leadership of the anti-apartheid movement. Thich Nhat Hanh, as mentioned earlier, has also been a major proponent of Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, particularly in the context of his work for peace and reconciliation in Vietnam. Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of engaged Buddhism, which calls for the application of Buddhist principles to social and political issues, was heavily influenced by Gandhi's belief in the interconnectedness of personal and social transformation. Like Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh believes that compassion and nonviolence are essential for creating a more just and peaceful world. The continued relevance of Gandhi's Buddhist-influenced approach to global peace and justice efforts, Gandhi's approach to nonviolence, compassion, and ethical leadership, deeply influenced by Buddhist teachings, remains highly relevant in today's world. As conflicts continue to arise over issues of ethnicity, religion, politics, and resources, Gandhi's philosophy offers a powerful alternative to the cycles of violence and retaliation that often characterize modern struggles for justice. His emphasis on the transformative power of nonviolence and the moral imperative to act with compassion and respect towards all beings provides a timeless framework for addressing contemporary social, political, and environmental challenges. Many global peace and justice efforts continue to draw on Gandhi's Buddhist-influenced philosophy as a model for creating positive change. Whether in movements for racial justice, environmental sustainability, or political freedom, Gandhi's emphasis on truth, nonviolence, and compassion offers a guiding light for those seeking to create a more just and harmonious world. As the world faces increasing challenges related to climate change, economic inequality, and social division, Gandhi's vision of a compassionate, nonviolent society based on ethical principles and spiritual growth remains as relevant as ever. His legacy continues to inspire leaders and activists around the world, reminding us that the path to true freedom and justice lies not in violence or domination but in love, compassion, and the pursuit of truth. Conclusion: Mahatma Gandhi's life and work were deeply influenced by Buddhist teachings, particularly the principles of nonviolence, ahiṃsā, and compassion, karuṇā. While Gandhi's primary spiritual allegiance was to Hinduism, his engagement with Buddhism enriched his understanding of ethical leadership, social justice, and political resistance. The Buddha's emphasis on ethical conduct, mindfulness, and the alleviation of suffering resonated with Gandhi's own commitment to truth, nonviolence, and compassion, and these principles became central to his philosophy of satyagraha. Throughout his life, Gandhi sought to apply the Buddhist ideals of compassion, nonviolence, and self-discipline in both his personal conduct and his leadership of the Indian independence movement. His ability to integrate these spiritual principles into political activism inspired not only the Indian people but also countless leaders and movements around the world. From the Dalai Lama to Martin Luther King Jr., from Aung San Suu Kyi to Nelson Mandela, Gandhi's legacy continues to shape the global discourse on peace, justice, and nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's philosophy offers a powerful and timeless vision of a compassionate and just society, where individuals take responsibility for their own moral and spiritual growth and work together for the well-being of all. His belief in the interconnectedness of all beings and his commitment to truth and nonviolence provide a guiding light for those seeking to create a more just and peaceful world. In a world that is often torn apart by violence, hatred, and division, Gandhi's Buddhist-influenced approach to ethical leadership, nonviolent resistance, and social justice offers a path forward, one that is grounded in the values of compassion, mindfulness, and moral responsibility. His life serves as a testament to the power of spiritual principles in shaping political and social change, and his legacy continues to inspire people around the world to work for a more just, compassionate, and harmonious society.